Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Monday, April 29th, and this is my astrological overview for the month of May 2019. So there's a lot going on this month. As always, the beginning of the month of May is incredibly dynamic. Things slow down a little bit as the month goes on. The first week to 10 days of May are pretty impactful. So a lot of my analysis this month focuses on early May. But the moon cycle itself is pretty intense, featuring a full moon in Scorpio, which is always fun, and then a Venus-Uranus conjunction on the full moon as well. New moon is in Taurus this month, early on in the month. So there's a lot of things to talk about based on the moon cycle itself, on that new moon, and then the full moon later in the month. I think it's on the 18th. We'll come to that as well. But like I said, there's so much early in the month, it's hard to summarize it or tie all of the themes together neatly. So I'm going to do my best, but I'll show you just putting a chart up now, and I'll just give you a sense of how kind of complicated the early part of the month is. So first of all, what I would point out is that at the very beginning of the month, you're going to notice that Mercury in Aries is going to be going through squares through the first 3-4 days of the month to Saturn, the south node of the moon, and Pluto, while simultaneously making a trine to Jupiter and Sagittarius. Now, when we're doing mundane forecasting work like this, the houses do not matter, because you're forecasting for everybody globally, just sort of saying this is where the planets are heading based on their interactions. This is likely what you're going to experience. It becomes more specific when we root all of these planetary transits in a rising sign or a sun sign. For example, if a horoscope writer is going to write about Pisces, this is the chart that they would erect for Pisces rising or Pisces sun sign. You put Pisces on the ascendant, and then you're translating all of these aspects in terms of the houses that they fall in within this whole sign house arrangement. But we're not doing that in this case. We're just talking about transits for a lot of people, regardless of what their charts may look like or what kind of astrology you were born under. So this is just very general. So we're not really taking the houses into account. I say this because inevitably someone asks every single time I do these. So I thought I would just issue this disclaimer right away so you understand. But you can see right away, I mean, it's right away. And then the other thing that's happening, if that's not enough, the very beginning of the month, Mercury is in a sextile with Mars. Now, the reason that that's really significant is that Mercury is in Mars's sign of Aries, and Mars is in Mercury's sign of Gemini. So they're creating what's called a mutual reception between one another. Now, mutual receptions are very positive, generally speaking, and it means that the two planets are sort of working together. So here we see a Mars-Mercury dynamic to start the month. Mars-Mercury is incisive, is very intelligent. It's a good time to be strategizing, analyzing. You want to be a little bit careful of verbal or mental sharpness or explosiveness, tendency toward combat or argumentation verbally. But it's also very good for learning and for articulating yourself. It has that kind of mental ninja feeling to it. And this is, of course, blown up and exaggerated to a certain extent by the trine to Jupiter. So it might be a little bit more pompous, or it might be even a little bit more arrogant on the negative side. On the positive side, you can have a lot of charisma, a lot of enthusiasm mentally and verbally, and in terms of finding good teachers or learning important lessons, expanding or growing your mind or your understanding of something. So all of these are really positive indications at the beginning of the month. However, what makes it more difficult is, oh wait, Mercury's going to go through squares to Saturn, South Node, and Pluto. On the dark side, that can make a person a verbal or mental bully. It can make it can turn all of this energy into something that is a lot more strict, conservative, harsh, severe, rigid, formal, structured, tense, unyielding, unforgiving, punitive, like that. It can also signal a time of saying things that are very grandiose, very cutting, very dramatic, and very distinct. You know, those times you say something and it's like, when I was a kid, I remember the example that was used was if you squeeze toothpaste out of the tube and then you try to get it back in, you can't. Similarly, when we say really cutting, definitive, severe, sharp things, even if they're true, even if they contain some element of truth, you often can't take them back. The damage is done. You have to be really careful about that around the beginning of the month. But you also think about executive decision making, severe decisions, severe consequences, severe words and actions. That's all Saturn getting in on the mix of a very intense Mercury in Aries that's got support from the god of war and is being blown up and made really big and kind of maybe even puffed up by Jupiter. On the other hand, it's a moment where you can be very clear, very decisive, very formal or structured mentally, verbally, in terms of contracts and agreements. You can be very mature. So the beginning of the month has this kind of double-edged sword feeling to it, either too much, too harsh, too severe, too argumentative, too rigid, especially mentally or intellectually, or perhaps very wise, mature, solid, good decision making, maybe having to make some hard choices, having to limit things or having to more clearly define things. But that's the energy of the first couple of days of the month. Now, right after that comes through, we're getting into the new moon on May 4th. Now, the new moon on May 4th will come in Taurus, and it's a ways away from Uranus. Uranus is in the same sign. So every new moon cycle in Taurus all the way, into like 2026 or whatever is going to have a Uranian flavor to it. It's Taurus. So there's that grounded, earthy, sensual, sort of productive, practical feeling. Don't let Tauruses fool you. There's a lot of ambition in Taurus, but it has that feeling of, kind of earthy, practical, sensual, grounded results. All Taurus new moons, I get kind of excited about. The moon's exalted in Taurus. I'm a Taurus rising, so it's always like, usually I'm feeling better health-wise, or I'm starting to feel like a kind of a lift in my step during the new moons in the springtime. Springtime in the Northern Hemisphere. But Taurus new moons are usually, you think of, especially you want to check on the position of Venus at a Taurus new moon. That's where this gets a little complicated. You've got Uranus, which can be a little destabilizing. So every new moon in Taurus is going to also introduce the themes of destabilization, paradigm changes, things like that. And then you look at the position of Venus. And where is Venus? Well, Venus is in Aries, a little bit more combative, a little bit edgier, a little like sort of out of Venus's natural element in Mars' sign, what would traditionally be called her exile or detriment. So you're also thinking about a new beginning that may also come at the cost of different kinds of conflicts that are arising in relationships, sometimes drastic or severe changes of style or appearance or aesthetic that aren't necessarily that great. Venus a little debilitated, so you got to be careful with that. But otherwise, the Taurian new moon is, I think that the positive thing they could introduce will be the need to provoke or stimulate change, and to not care or worry as much as Taurus might normally care or worry about appearances. So there might be just a little bit edgier feeling to this Taurus new moon where, the goal of Taurus might be to create a better stable base to operate from. Might have to ruffle a few feathers to get there this moon cycle. That's the mood I'm picking up from this one. So from there, if you go to May 5th and May 6th, like I said, it's very busy at the beginning of the month. May 5th and May 6th, you've got a Mars opposition to Jupiter. This has bravado and machismo written all over it, especially of the mental, intellectual, political, ideological, philosophical variety. It's Mars in the sign of Gemini, of Mercury. So it's very mentally combative, or dealing with themes that Geminis deal with, which is flexibility, open-mindedness, curiosity. Sometimes there's kind of a trickster quality, sometimes deception, lies, what's true and what's false, but also a more mentally erratic and changeable quality, curious, like learning or investigating things. Mars and Gemini is like that. Um, Opposite Jupiter in Sagittarius, right? Which is definitely more of your, um, you know, Jupiter in Sagittarius is going to be a bit more committed to its beliefs and its ideals and its sense of optimism and hope. And let's build a larger whole. Let's cohere. Let's affirm. Let's make bigger. And Mars in Gemini is more analytical, slicing and dicing, breaking things apart, deconstructing things. So when you put those two things together, the possibility for a synthesis, a very intelligent analysis and synthesis, mentally, intellectually, or philosophically, is possible. But also you have that potentially sort of swashbuckling, sort of arrogant, argumentative quality. If you go on social media, the early part of the month, you very easily end up, thrown into all sorts of diatribes and fight. Now that stuff exists like every day, but I mean, this is one of those transits where I would be a little bit more careful of getting into some kind of needless argument about religion or politics, for example. But also, I think it has it has a kind of brave, knightly quality to it. There's a feeling of crusading, visioning, fighting for something you believe in. So that energy is pretty intense around the 5th and the 6th. Now, if you go forward another day to the 7th and the 8th, then look what happens. The 7th into the 8th, Mercury is going to conjoin Uranus in Taurus. Now, this is Taurus, so it's a little different from Gemini, right? But it's still Mercury, which is the ruler of Gemini. So you're following up a potentially very kind of combustible, mental, philosophical moment with another moment that's very erratic, inventive, original, sort of rebellious, around the same kind of mental, intellectual, communicative qualities of Mercury. It's a great moment to discover or work with a new form of technology, to say something or do something sort of provocative, to have mental breakthroughs, aha moments, epiphanies, also to put your foot in your mouth, so it's got that quality to it as well. Erratic things when driving or with technology are also possible. You got to be careful about making some kind of bold fashion statement or some kind of bold statement that tips the scales, because you think it's going to be beautiful, you think it's going to be pleasing to others, and it ends up being really provocative and maybe not such a great way. That's Mercury saying something erratic. Uranus in the sign of Venus, while Venus is debilitated in Aries, ends up saying something what you think will be original or funny or clever ends up becoming offensive, which nowadays I have to say it's really annoying in the news how every other day someone says something that is really not that offensive, and it's blown up to make the person ends up looking like they're just this awful person, and people end up issuing apologies that nobody really believes. And so you're going to be careful of all of that, around the beginning of the month. I would not be surprised to see erratic things happening in the media. Like, for example, people say things and it's, the Rosie O'Donnell thing, or, I'm not saying, I don't know what she said even. I know she said something at one point or whatever. So but there's also technology, science, breakthroughs in different kinds of healing or intellectual modalities, like discovering a new treatment for a disease. Mercury, Uranus can be very exciting like that as well. Then you go forward to, May 6th to May 10th, which we're in the range of already. And you're going to see Venus going through the same exact things that Mercury went through to start the month, squares to Saturn, the South Node, and Pluto, while also making a trine to Jupiter. And then you're going to notice that around the same time, it's not exactly the same time, but Venus is also getting in on a sextile to Mars. So, I mean, it's funny because it's like the first wave of that energy comes from Mercury, and then another wave comes from Venus and Aries. I like to think that Mercury in the earlier part is very mental, verbal, trying to figure out details, contracts, working through things in a more mental or intellectual way. And then Venus comes through and kind of smooths it over with with a human touch. Venus is more sensual. Venus is more about creating harmony. Now here she is debilitated. So in Aries, which is again more combative, She's getting into a sextile with Mars and Gemini. So it's not like, this is in some ways more of the same. This would suggest to me the potential for very serious, acute, harsh, or severe things to happen in relationships, things that are overly strict or overly harsh. You've got a little bit of heartbreak with Venus and Pluto, things like betrayal or really deep combative things in relationships. Like, I want to be free, I want to be an individual, but I have a really, really controlling, dark, heavy boyfriend. You know, that's kind of the Venus-Pluto dynamic. But you also have the other way around, where you have people who are really rebellious and disrespectful of tradition, or have no sense of boundaries or proper etiquette, or no good discipline in their life, and they might get taken tasks. There might be some pretty harsh consequences for that kind of thing. Venus is also receiving some big help from Jupiter right now. So Venus-Jupiter trines in fire are going to, it's about inflammation. It's about growth in fire signs. That can mean that literally things are setting on fire, as we saw with the Grand Fire Trine last month, and the cathedrals, the temples that burned, and so forth. This can be inflammatory, and because Venus is going through and Mercury is going through the same squares to the south bend at the south bending that the sun went through when Notre Dame caught on fire, for example. You can also see really heavy contractive events where there's conflagration, there's actual burning, or there's something is being reduced to ashes, something is crumbling, and it has a kind of more intense confrontational feeling around it. For example, the same place was activated by the sun, and we had, not long after that, we had the Easter bombings that happened in, I think it was Sri Lanka. So these are dangerous spots in terms of like really sort of tempestuous energy with the planets and fire signs moving through the squares to Saturn, Pluto, and Jupiter, while trying to enlarging Jupiter in a fire sign. So, you know, in relationships, you want to be careful of self-righteousness, of getting on a high horse about things, of being overly rigid or controlling, or totally disrespectful of boundaries, tradition, of having no integrity or ethics or rules or discipline that one lives by. Either of those extremes won't do very well around this time. And so you can see how the first 10 days of the month, it's quite a train of energy coming through. The other thing that can happen with Venus in particular is that Venus-Saturn dynamics age like wine. It's like Saturn is age and time, and Venus is beauty. So sometimes there's this quality. Venus in Aries can be very youthful. There's this feeling of like a young woman growing up, you know, and there's a young woman in all of us, right? We all have a feminine component. So there's something about Venus learning to stand her ground or fight or become more mature or solid somehow. Venus becoming wiser with trine to Jupiter and square to Saturn and Pluto. But there can be eruptive sort of volcanic events that are more turbulent, and there's more ego and clashes of will and control and stuff like that. So like I said, it's a really busy early part of the month. Now, again, I ultimately, with Jupiter in the mix of those two transits from Mercury and Venus, I do think that there are benefits that come out of this. There is true wisdom. There is true growth. There's room for optimism here. But I'm especially, for myself, I'm making a special note to be very careful of what kind of things I'm putting into my mind, what things I'm allowing myself to be stimulated by, and being very careful not to get into big rants, or be very careful of criticizing people, or of engaging in conflict, rather than trying to listen, trying to understand, trying to be patient, and trying to really be supportive of others. I know that if I stay home in that, I'm usually okay during these transits, but it's a discipline. It's not easy to do. These transits pull us. So, all right, we go beyond this, and the 10th to the 15th during this period, I like this part of the month a lot better. You're going to see the sun going through trines to Saturn, South Node, and Pluto on the 13th. I think it might even go into the 14th. You're going to see, yes, into the 14th, The moon in Virgo is going to get in on a grand Earth trine. So very productive, very practical. Would not be surprised to see things related to the Earth really stepping up, with the moon in the sign of the Virgin. A picture of a young woman. I'm reminded of this young woman. I forget her name, but she's like 15 or 16. She's a big advocate for environmentalism right now. I think this is going to be a productive period, but also a period where our attention is drawn to issues regarding the environment. Remember, Uranus is in Taurus right now. I think it's very possible that something important happens in the environment. I hate to think of a disaster, but at this point, the Earth is speaking, right? The Earth has her own voice at this point, and I think this might be a moment where the Earth speaks. The Earth has something to say. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of our main points in Earth at this time: Uranus, Mercury, the Sun, Moon, Saturn, South Node, Pluto. So it's very earthy. Remember, Earth is not just practical and dry and productive. It can be like, this would be a really good time to get some things done, to see productivity and results and things like that. But the other thing here is that with Uranus, there's a more erratic revolutionary energy at work. With Mercury, Saturn, Pluto, the South Node, there's the mind is really present in this one. The moon is in Mercury's sign for the grand fire, or the grand Earth trine. There's a more of a mental, maybe even technological or intellectual quality on board. Saturn and Pluto, there's a deep restructuring, a death and a rebirth, the end of something. So it's just as much about rebuilding or reimagining the structure of something as it is about churning out results. That's what I'm feeling about this 10th to 15th grand Earth trine period. Then we go into, let's see, 15th and 16th. Right as that's concluding, Venus is going to pop right into Taurus, and then we're going to see a conjunction to Uranus happening really quickly by the time of the full moon, which is on the 18th. So now things get really interesting again. Another very dynamic moment. Now you can see like things are slowing down. There's not so many like boom, 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 like triple, quadruple aspects all happening simultaneously like those first 10 days. But now we have the moon, full moon in Scorpio, right as Mars is entering the sign of its fall in Cancer. I have a feeling that issues around family, karma, around race, around tribe, around culture, around group, because those are the things that the moon represents: our emotional bonds, our family bonds, our ethnic bonds. There's going to be, I believe, a more intense, confrontational, deep, painful, healing energy around those areas of life. And I say that because moon in Scorpio often gets down to the more intense dynamics within family, home, mothers, tribe, nation. But with Mars, its ruler, also being in its fall in the moon sign, there's a mutual reception between Mars and the moon, and they're both badly debilitated. This feels like ancestral karmic wounds, cleansing, healing, painful events, but maybe cathartic and purgative and ultimately healing events relative to the deeper bonds in our life, those that are both very personal as in family, and those that are more collective as in society, nation, race, culture, things like groups that we belong to that are a little bit more abstract from our immediate environment anyway. For some of us, we're very disconnected from our ancestors, for example, but you could see things happening to your ancestors in a different part of the world during this time. So you have to get a little creative about this. But then you see Venus and Uranus getting together in Taurus at the exact same time. This is a very cathartic moment for Venus. It's about, this is a picture of the liberated woman. This is also a picture of potential combined with the full moon and combined with Mars in its fall. I hate to say this, but Venus is peaceful places. This is the potential for, peaceful places or sanctuaries, so to speak, which Venus rules. Sanctuaries, bathhouses, parks, public places where people picnic. I mean, just any place that's like Venusian. Hey, let's relax and find harmony. Or hey, let's go in. Venus ruled temples, in ancient astrology. The Uranus dynamic in Taurus, one of the things you don't see a lot of people talking about is the fact that we will see more disruptive and potentially chaotic events, both to nature, where peace and harmony are more apparent. I'm not saying nature isn't full of tooth and nail as well, but just when you get out and you are walking through the woods, or you're just kind of in nature, you're in the Taurian world, you're in the Venusian world, where you're in the natural world. It's an earthy sign. And to a certain extent, people have, for the most part, people really love being under the clouds in the sky. And so the earth can be disrupted, that feeling of the earthy paradise being really disrupted by more of the more natural disasters, more events that draw our attention to what's really happening below the surface. Well, the same thing can happen to public sanctuaries, to parks, to grocery stores, to religious sanctuaries. These are places that can experience violence and disruption while Uranus is in Taurus. And I would not be alarmed to see something that should be peaceful or Venusian being really disrupted with potential violence under the full moon. However, I will say, on the positive side, thinking about things that could happen that might be a little bit more uplifting, you're also thinking about inventiveness around style and appearance, kind of Venusian artistic or aesthetic revolution. This is a better time for a wardrobe change or some kind of inventive new artistic technique or something like that than earlier in the month when Venus is still in Aries. You could also see around this time some kind of liberation happening, the need for greater freedom, greater independence, fortunate events happening, Venus, that liberate Uranus. So you have, it's quite mixed. You have to take it into context of, where everything else is right now, the Saturn-Pluto South Node conjunction, the full moon in Scorpio, its ruler Mars and its fall in Cancer. I think this is going to be more of a challenging full moon, but I do believe that the opportunity for a deeper level of emotional healing and some kind of creative catharsis that may actually bring benefits or may feel like a relief by the time it's all done is there for us with Venus and Uranus as well. So from there we go into Mars. We went through that. On May 21st, this is kind of a fun one. It's just really brief, but on the 21st, we're going to see, you'll see Mercury hopping into Gemini. And the thing that's interesting about this one for me is that Mercury's combust the sun. But as soon as it hops into Gemini, it's Cazimi and in its own chariot, which means it's in the sign of its own rulership. It starts to gain a certain kind of protectedness from the beams of the sun, from the heat and intensity of the sun that it's in, which normally is a debilitating condition. Plus, it goes Cazimi, means it becomes greatly empowered. So I'm feeling like suddenly mental, intellectual, mercurial things take on a lot of strength right around the time that the sun enters Gemini, which I'm kind of looking forward to personally. I think that's pretty exciting. So I don't know what to expect from this one exactly, just that speech, learning, communication, information, messages arriving that are exciting or genuinely positive, being empowered by an authority figure. Those are different things that I would expect under Sun Mercury. Cazimi, with Mercury coming into its chariot in Gemini. Then on May 23rd, I have this one highlighted as well, which is Mars in Cancer in its fall going through a square to Mercury, or to Chiron in Aries. This, again, feels like a more volatile, emotional transit. It's a moment of, more of the volatile energies of Mars sort of spilling over and perhaps wounding us, or revealing a wound to us, or helping us understand something or learn something. So learning, healing, wounds, wounding. It's pretty acute though, because obviously Chiron is in Mars' sign of Aries. So there's some reception here. There is something that Chiron is going to be up to at this moment. The wounded healer, the teacher, the sage that teaches through wounding. So this is a kind of a more acute moment with Mars in its fall, especially in a very a very watery lunar ruled sign. It's a more vulnerable moment. There's going to be some really vulnerable moments in this month from the time of the full moon on. And then from the 29th to the 30th, that's the last transit of the month that I have highlighted. That's also a big one because you're going to see a T-square taking place between Mercury, Neptune, and Jupiter. This, to me, is kind of a magical transit to close the month. It has the feeling of mental and intellectual expansion, same kind of argumentative, philosophical quality that we started the month with. But with Neptune in the mix, it feels a little bit more magical. Watch for synchronicities, messages and dreams, non-ordinary states of consciousness, intuition, comprehension of vast, difficult ideas, finding a teacher, being really inspired by something, I'm thinking more of the magical connections with Neptune really in the mix here. A time of mental, imaginative exploration. Could be some really ungrounded thinking or the desire to alter your state in an unhealthy way. But otherwise, if you stay sober and don't lose your mind, I think this transit has the ability to be very enlightening, and I think kind of could allow you to, by the end of the month, everything you've gone through, all of us, I think that this transit closes the month with the feeling of starting to comprehend something or starting to see the bigger picture or understand why I've been going through some of the things I've been going through. So a good energy to close out the month. All right, well, that's what I've got for you guys. I'm going to turn over to making my individual sun and rising sign horoscope. So I put this one out first for you. I hope you all have a great month of May, and I look forward to seeing you again for June's overview. Take care.